So Friday, your revisions of exploratory reflection 1 are due, right? Everybody's got that. Does anybody have any further questions about that assignment before we proceed? So everybody gets, right, that it's just one text, right, that you're looking at for this. Okay, so this is going to be stage 1 of working on the midterm paper, right? Stage 2 is going to be assignment 5 on page 177, writing analytically. Now what that is going to ask you to do is that 10-on-1 process the textbook describes, and it's going to ask you to start building a paper from that, right? So what you are going to be doing, since you're looking at 5 texts here, what you're going to be doing is isolating a particular theme or issue you want to talk about that runs across those 5 texts, and then try to say 10 things about that, right? Figure out 10 things to say about that. And I would like to see scratch work alongside this too. So, give me the 500 to 750 words, and also give me the scratch work. And that's going to be phase 2 of paper 1, right? And also read chapter 7 in writing analytically for next time. Now, because midterm is coming up, I do want to talk a little bit about what the first full paper is going to look like. So let me just call that assignment up quickly. We'll talk through it, and you can ask me any questions that you have about it. Okay, so what you are going to do is use the texts that you've read in the human nature and the mind section to construct an argument of your own about the relationship between education and natural human capacities, right? So what these texts are calling human nature, right? So you will need to come up with a definition of education. You will need to come up with a definition of human nature that relies on these things that you have read, okay? You will be required to make use of all 5 sources, though you don't have to agree with all of them. The paper will be 1,000 to 1,500 words, and you will complete this in 2 stages in addition to the 2 we've already talked about, right? There's going to be a draft, and then there's going to be a final revised paper. Now, here's why I want you doing this, right? The sorts of things that we will be learning from this assignment. Right? So you're going to learn to develop and defend an original thesis. You're going to be using source material to construct an argument, even though it's source material I've given you. You're going to have to incorporate sources with which you disagree into an argument, so you're going to have to figure out how to deal with ideas that you don't agree with, right? You're going to be examining the same problem from multiple perspectives, and you're going to be revising and refining a draft into a finished argument.
You still can't use first person, right? You still want to be passive?
There's no hard and fast rule against using the first person in academic papers. I think that what's happened is a kind of general principle has been made by certain high school teachers into a kind of rigid rule. Here's why it's generally a good idea, especially when you're starting out as a writer, not to use the first person. If we write in third person, we tend to be more objective. And we tend to focus a little bit less on our own feelings and convictions, right? So it's probably a good idea to stay in the third person because it prevents us from making things too personal, too much about us, right? I'm not gonna say you can't use first person, but I would recommend against it. Okay. So in terms of the actual basic formal requirements here, right? So it's got to be 1,000 to 1,500 words. I want no fewer than 1,000 words, no more than 1,500, right? Longer is not always better. If you are trying to answer this particular question in more than 1,500 words, you're biting off more than you can chew, right? So keep it under 1,500, but over 1,000. All submissions must be double-spaced. As with every other assignment, the citations need to be in MLA style with a works cited page at the end and in-text parenthetical citations. So, like I said, I'll be looking at your draft of the exploratory reflection, which also required this tomorrow. And if anybody has got this a little mixed up, I will send you a link that will show you how to do this properly. You must also incorporate all 5 of the essays in the unit into your argument, right? So you have to use material from all 5 of the essays, even if all you're doing with one is disagreeing with it, right? Though again, provide reasons for disagreement. Don't just say, I think this idea sucks, right? Any questions so far on just like this base level stuff? Okay, we'll talk about the draft then. So the draft is going to have to be at least 75% of the total required length of the final paper in order to get full credit, right? So I'm grading the draft and the paper itself as separate assignments. You will get full credit for the draft if it is long enough and not plagiarized, right? So it has to be at least 750 words in order to count. Otherwise, the draft should represent your best attempt at responding to the assignment before receiving instructor feedback. So treat the draft as though it's the final version, right? Do the best you can in the draft, and then use my feedback to revise it, to make it better, right? So when you're writing, please remember the following. First, you have to take a position, right? You can't just say there are pros and cons to blah, or there are risks and benefits to blah, right? Or many people talk about human nature and education, that sort of thing, right? You have to take a position in this debate and argue for the position that you think is the strongest, right? You can't just say there are merits to all arguments here, right? You have to pick, you have to choose a side. Yeah, Danielle.
I guess this is the psychology major, this coming out in there, but what if our position is that without both, there can't be one or the other?
Without both of what?
Natures, like in the discussion of human nature.
Okay, that I guess that's still a position. What I'm saying here is that you can't not take a position,
Okay.
right?
This one, because you said don't go for both.
Well,
That's in my mind.
yeah, and you know, maybe I could have phrased that a little bit more clearly. Yeah, but it's essentially like what I'm saying is you have to make an argument, right?
But even an argument in the papers don't just have a counter argument.
Um,
On the other side.
Yeah, you should, if you can, at the very least, take arguments that conflict with yours seriously, and if you can't, you know, if you can't come to some sort of agreement with them, then you need to be able to explain why you think this is wrong, right? Why you think this is incorrect. So, you know, one thing you can do is, you know, like a big part of this argument is going to be coming up with definitions, right? Defining human nature, defining education, defining other parts of this question, right? So you can use some of these texts as negative examples, right? So, you know, Sun Tzu says human nature is this, but I disagree because of X, Y, and Z, right? And where X, Y, and Z are pieces of evidence and not your personal opinion, right? Make sense? Okay. Second point, and this kind of follows on from that, right, is to remember that there are more than 2 possible positions on any given issue, right? We tend to fall into binary thinking pretty easily. Indeed, like a lot of what we do here is look for binaries, right? And a lot of these essays are built on binary oppositions of some sort. But remember that you are reading here 5 different perspectives on the same issue, right? And they all have differences, even those that seem superficially similar, right? So remember that you're looking at 5 different points of view here. And that it's not just, it's not a simple choice between vanilla and chocolate.
So does this paper like count as our midterm and the paper 2 will be like our final?
Yeah. I don't do exams in composition classes because I don't think there's any point to. I don't think there's really any content in this class that is testable, really. Like the whole point is to make you better, to help you get better at writing papers. Then it seems to me that what we ought to be doing is writing papers. So that's why I do a midterm paper and a final paper and not exams. All right, I also want you guys to be quoting your sources directly, right? I know it is the norm in some disciplines, particularly in the social sciences, to summarize and paraphrase. That's not the norm in the humanities. Now, part of this is because I want to see exactly what you're getting from your sources, and I want to see, how you are analyzing the language of the source. And again, part of this is convention within the discipline, right? So make sure that you are quoting your source directly. However, don't quote too much, right? Quote as much as you need to make your points. There are two things to be careful of when you're quoting, right? One is quoting excessively to try to build up word count, right? Don't do that because we all see right through it. It's like, why is this whole page one giant quote, somebody couldn't make the word count, yeah. The other thing to avoid doing is cherry picking quotes, right? So, like for example, leaving words out, using ellipses that don't quite fit the argument you're trying to make, right? Like trying to cut up somebody else's argument to fit the point you're trying to make, right? Don't do that. Make sure that you represent your source's arguments fairly, right? In a way that they would agree with. To the extent that you can determine what they would agree with, of course, right? Okay, so anybody have any questions about this?
Does maybe we do good on this reflection? Because I don't know why it's a thing.
Uh-huh.
Plagiarism is a thing. Like, if we do good, can we use what we did in the reflection for this paper?
Yeah, as long as you don't kind of cut and paste it verbatim, right?
Okay.
But yeah, you can certainly use some of the work you did in the reflection as a basis for building the paper, right?
I don't see how self-plagiarism is weird. Like, you wrote it.
What's that? Yeah, you wrote it, but I am also looking for you to be able to expand what you've done, right? And to see how well you can rephrase your own language and things like that, right? So yeah.
So this paper is going to be based off the draft that we just turned in, but it's going to be like expanded and expanded.
Yeah, think of that exploratory reflection as sort of practice, right? So you're using that to isolate a particular issue in one of the texts. And then you can maybe use that, it's to get you used to reading one of the texts closely. And then you can maybe use that issue, right, as the basis of the longer paper, if you think it's worth doing so.
Okay, and so this paper that you're telling us to do, base it off the first text we did or all five?
All five.
So
this is on all
include
five.
all five.
Yep, you're including all five of those.
And
Yep.
then pick a point, like pick whose side you're on, or if you're not on the right side.
Yeah, well, I think what I'd like you to do, rather than picking one of their arguments, is try to use the things that they say, right? Use the things they write to come up with your own definitions of the key terms, right? To come up with your own definitions of what human nature is, what it means to be educated, that sort of thing, right? And how these two things are interrelated, and make your own argument based on the sources, right? So you're not just kind of like say, well, I agree with Mencius, or I agree with Hannah Arendt, or whatever, right? You're using all five of these to define the terms of the argument, and then making your own argument. Does that make sense?
So basically, we're saying, like, not these words, but I believe human nature is good. And then you would use, like, Mencius as an example, saying, like, why do you think it's good? and like how it provides, and then how it backs up your claim?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you would use Mencius and maybe other thinkers who seem to think that human nature is good to come up with that definition, right? And it's like, okay, so I think human nature is basically good, and this is how I think education shapes it, right? Or assists it, or whatever.
Can we also like include Master Cow in it too? When he was basically arguing with me?
Yeah. Well, remember, Master Cow is kind of like the foil that Mencius is using, right? So Master Cow in Mencius's pieces is always wrong. So I would suggest sticking to Mencius's arguments in that piece, right? Unless you're trying to demonstrate what he's reacting to, right?
And we could go to the writing center.
You can absolutely go to the Writing Center. I encourage you to go to the Writing Center. You will get half a letter grade's extra credit if you go to the Writing Center, right? So it is.
She asked me about that because the person I had said that they had you, I think last year.
Uh-huh.
And they asked me, they're like, do you get extra credit for going to the writing center? And I was like, I don't know. Maybe.
On the big assignments, yes.
Okay.
Yes, so on this and on paper 2, yes, you do.
Because I went for the magic one that we had to do, the magic article.
Yeah, I don't do that on the homework assignments, in part because there just aren't enough points at stake. But yeah, I mean, you can certainly still go for the smaller assignments, and they will help you, and you'll probably get a better grade than you would get if you didn't go. But I only actually give extra credit on the big assignments. Yes, question?
How do we let you know that? Is it just when we sign in?
They-
It's going to show up?
Yeah, they tell me.
Okay.
They will send me an email that says that you were there.
Do you know if they have like an online format?
They do, yes. You can make online appointments. Go to the Writing Center website and you can click through that and set up online appointments. They absolutely do that. In fact, I think they're doing more of that this semester because of, well, collapse of civilization as we know it and all that. So, yeah. Okay, so in terms of how you are going to be graded here for this, right? So I do have a grading rubric at the end of the assignment. And remember that this is a sort of cumulative thing, right? So in order to get a C, you have to meet the requirements for a D, or to get a B, you have to meet the requirements for a C and a D, and so on and so forth, right? So as long as it is long enough and formatted properly, you will pass, right? You'll get a D. In order to get a C, you have to actually address the assignment question, right? You have to actually do what the assignment is telling you to do. You have to demonstrate that you understand the primary sources, cite all sources properly, and advance a clear thesis. To get a B, you have to make sure the argument is clear, consistent, and arranged effectively, that your primary sources are quoted directly and not just paraphrased or summarized, that you are not treating opinion as facts, and you are making clear and effective transitions between paragraphs. An A paper has an original and nuanced argument, deals effectively with evidence that contradicts or complicates your argument, so exactly the kind of thing you guys were asking about a minute ago. Achieves balance between argument and evidence, which we're going to talk about today. Properly contextualizes the argument and is free of glaring historical errors. Analyzes primary sources instead of just plugging them in as evidence. Again, something we're going to work on today. And follows a single line of argument to its conclusion without digressions, right? So this is how you achieve different grade levels on the paper, right? So this should give you clear criteria to work with. Now, before we start into today's material, does anybody have any other questions at all? Yes, Danielle.
And we use sources when citing other than the book.
No, stick to the sources I've given you for this, and then you will do independent research on paper 2. But for now, we're just learning to write an argument from sources, using sources that you've already had in front of you.
How I'm basing my argument is off of other facts
facts exist.
So what you should be doing for this is making sure that your argument actually comes out of the evidence in the sources, right? Rather than coming up with an argument beforehand and trying to find sources that fit that argument, right? So we're going to be proceeding by what we call inductive reasoning. Have any of you heard this term before? Do any of you know what inductive reasoning is?
Isn't it like basing stuff off of what you already know? Deductive.
Sort of. So deductive reasoning starts with a general principle and then applies it to specific examples. So if I were to say something like, horror movies of the 1980s are socially conservative, I start from that basic principle. And then I find examples that fit that basic principle, right? That's deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning uses specific examples to infer a general principle. So what you're going to be doing here is starting with the data and using that data to come up with an argument, right? So the process I want you guys to follow is inductive. Does this make sense? Is everybody with me? Okay, this is this is actually kind of a good segue into what we're going to talk about today, right? So we're talking about claim and evidence today. So what do we mean when we say claim and evidence? What is a claim? Okay, it is a statement, right? More specifically, what is it?
Possessive statement?
Okay, different kind of claim.
Okay.
This isn't like a prospector putting down a stake on the California river in California saying, this is my place to pan for gold. No, this is...
Like a claim is what you're trying to say or what you believe in. Kind of like, it's not like a thesis, but like yours like a thesis.
Yeah, a thesis is a kind of claim, right? And I think with theory, at least the way we use the word theory publicly, right, like in public discourse rather than actual science, yeah, then that's more or less accurate, right? So remember that the science as a theory is usually something we're pretty sure is true, right? A theory is something that has been tested over and over again. And
Is it like something that can be proven?
yeah, a claim is something that needs to be proven, right? A claim is a statement that is not on its own objectively true. So then what is evidence?
Something to prove your claim?
Well, how so? Like how does evidence help demonstrate a claim? What is it more specifically? Yeah, evidence refers to facts, data, right? Things you can actually look up and verify.
It provides like backup. Yeah, it's backup your claim.
Yeah, and I think that's the way we often think of it, right? Is that evidence is what backs the claim up. The way I want you to try to think of it, though, instead is, again, using this inductive process, right? Think of evidence not as the thing you use to back up a claim, but as the information from which you generate a claim, right? So you look at this particular body of data or facts, right? You make connections between different facts, and then you come up with a claim about those facts, right? That's how most academic writing really works. Most of the writing you're going to be asked to do in most of your classes is going to proceed that way rather than the other way, right? Rather than starting with a claim and finding evidence for it. So the first thing we need to make sure we can do, right, is recognize the difference between a claim and a piece of evidence. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put a couple of statements up on the board, right? You tell me which is the claim and which is the evidence and why. Andrew Jackson displayed racist attitudes towards Native Americans. He forced the Cherokee to move from Georgia to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears. Which is the claim, which is the evidence?
The first one is the claim, second one
Okay, and how do we know?
because
The claim is like specifically saying a statement, like what he did.
Yeah.
And then second one is like the actions that he took to that claim.
Okay, so yeah, the second one, right, is a historical fact you could look up and verify, right? You can look in a book or on the fucking internet and you can see whether or not this is true, right? This is an interpretation of a fact, right? Now, in order to make the claim that, former President Andrew Jackson displayed racist attitudes towards people generally or towards any particular group would probably require more evidence than this single action, right? Which could perhaps be explained in other ways as well. But at least we recognize what the difference is here, right? So remember that the claim is always going to be an interpretation of a piece of evidence, right? So if we think of claim as interpretation, it's not an opinion, because an opinion is sort of a gut level feeling that isn't really based on anything except our own feelings, right? A claim or an argument is something that is based on evidence, right? So one of the things that I want us to try to get at here is to not have opinions so much as to make claims and have arguments, right? Opinion is also kind of a dangerous word. When you say to somebody, I am entitled to my opinion, what do you usually mean?
You can think what you want and it doesn't matter what they say.
Yeah, that you're not going to change your mind whatever the other person is. You're essentially kind of refusing to engage with them, right? So that's another reason I don't really want to use the word opinion, is because it's something that people use to shut down a conversation, right? When you say I'm entitled to my opinion, basically you're telling the other person to shut up, right? And that you're not going to listen. Okay, so this next example is taken from a book by George Orwell called The Road to Wigan Pier. Have any of you read George Orwell? Have you read 1984 Animal Farm? Okay, I think it's still a sign in a lot of schools, right? So, yeah, you may have encountered Orwell before. Good. So, this particular book is about the conditions in mining communities in northern England during the 1930s. Right, so first sentence. Middle class people are fond of saying that the miners wouldn't wash themselves properly even if they could, but this is nonsense. Where pithead baths exist, right, that is baths that are located exactly at the mines, practically all the men use them. So where's the claim and where's the evidence? Yeah.
The second one is the evidence, and the first one is the claim.
Yeah, what's the giveaway that the first one is a claim?
I would say, most like, I don't know if you're wanting me to tear that apart, but I'm guessing middle class people don't go to the mines.
Okay, so yeah. So what he's doing here, there are actually two levels in the claim here, right? One is a claim that he says other people make about the miners, right? And then what the sentence really is his claim about their claim, right? He's using a piece of evidence, right, about the extent to which the miners use bath facilities at the mines to disprove someone else's claim, right? So yeah, this is the evidence, right? Again, this is the thing that you could look up or verify somehow, right? And this is the claim. And I would say but this is nonsense is a clear indication that what we've got here is a claim, right? What he's doing here is expressing an attitude towards someone else's position, right? So that makes this a claim. Okay, everybody with me? Everybody got it? Okay, let's try one or two more here. So this is from a book of art theory by a German critic by the name of Walter Benjamin. The essay is called The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And he's talking about the way industrialization and the ability to reproduce works of art using machines has changed the way artists work, right? Or the way art is produced and consumed. So the Greeks had only two procedures for technically reproducing a work of art: founding and stamping. And if you don't know what founding and stamping are, just suffice to say they're processes that are done by hand, right, not by machine. Mechanical reproduction of a work of art represents something new. Which is the claim and which is the evidence? Which is the verifiable fact and which is the interpretation of that fact? Yes?
Are they both?
No.
I think the mechanical is the claim, and then the two procedures is the evidence, because you can look up the procedures that they did.
Yeah, you can do a little research and figure out what the Greeks knew about reproducing works of art, right? What processes they used. So yeah, this is evidence. And this is the conclusion that Benjamin has drawn from that evidence, right? Okay, so since this ancient culture did not have any means of reproducing works of art except by hand, mechanical reproduction of a work of art must be something that is new, right?
So do you make a claim based off of evidence, or you make, so you make like a claim based off of evidence, or do you make a claim and then find evidence to support that?
The first one, yeah, that is the point I've been trying to make generally, is that when you are actually making claims, you need to have the evidence first, right? The claim should come out of the evidence rather than the other way around. Otherwise, then it's pretty easy to just kind of cherry pick pieces of evidence that fit your preconceived idea, right? So what you should be doing, yeah, always is starting with the evidence and working your way up to a claim, right? By looking for commonalities in the evidence. Right, so this is why I'm telling you to think of the claim as an interpretation of the evidence, right? All right, so one more of these, and then we'll move on to something slightly different. This is from a book called The Wretched of the Earth by a psychoanalyst from Martinique by the name of Frantz Fanon. Fanon was interested in the way formerly colonized peoples constructed their identity once the colonizing force left. So he's talking here specifically about the role of black soldiers in the French army. In the French colonial army, the black officers served first of all as interpreters. The colonized is elevated above his status in proportion to his adoption of the mother country's cultural standards. So what's the claim, what's the evidence?
The first one is evidence, the second one.
Yeah. You could look this up, right? You could look this up and see what role black soldiers in the French colonial army played before they were promoted, right? And yeah, the second is an interpretation of what it takes to get promoted in the French colonial army, right? That soldiers from colonized territories in particular, in order to move ahead, have to embrace French language and French values, right? So yeah, this is evidence. This is a claim. Now, there is a particular reason why I wanted you guys talking about how you are distinguishing between claim and evidence here. A lot of this is because we often feel like the connection between a claim that we make and the evidence that we generate it from should be clear to everybody, right? In most cases, it is not. So one thing that you always need to be doing is making sure that you're spelling out for your reader how you got this idea from this set of evidence, right? You need to make those connections explicit for your reader. Now, one thing that might help us think along these lines is an intellectual exercise that originates with Greek philosophers called the syllogism. Are any of you familiar with syllogisms? Do any of you know what a syllogism is? I'm going to assume that means no.
I've heard of it, I just forgot.
Okay, you've heard the term before. Okay, so maybe if I put the classic example on the board that might spark something in your memory. Right. All humans are mortal. Socrates is human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. And this is basically a form of deductive reasoning, right? You have a general principle applied to a specific example from which you draw a conclusion. And it's a good way to test whether a particular idea is logical or not, right? Whether it makes logical sense. So the terms have to be in agreement in the right way for a syllogism to work, right? So these two terms have to agree with each other. These two terms have to agree with each other. And these two terms have to agree with each other in order for a syllogism to be valid. So I'm going to give you another example here that will show you some of the difficulties that syllogisms give us, right? Like one of the problems with using this is your only means of testing out your ideas. Right. All elephants have wings. Steve is an elephant. Therefore, Steve has wings. Is this a valid syllogism?
Poor Steve.
Dang. Going after Steve like that.
Steve is an all, so all elephants aren't proven to have wings.
Well, does this fit the same model we have up here?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's logical, right? But it's not true. Right? So what we're noticing here is there's a difference between a logical statement and a true statement, right? If you start from a faulty principle, then you end up with a faulty conclusion. Right? So there's a way we can rework the syllogism to make sure that we are getting a little bit closer to both truth value and sort of looking at the way our ideas are connected to each other, right? There's a guy named Stephen Toulmin. Maybe that is subconsciously where I got the name Steve for the elephant. Stephen Toulmin was a British philosopher of language. And he came up with what is called the Toulmin Method of argumentation. It's basically a slightly altered form of the syllogism, right? So there are three parts. There's a claim. There's what Toulmin calls backing, which corresponds to what we've been calling evidence. And there is a warrant. Now the warrant is the part we've been leaving out, right? The warrant is the connection between the backing and the claim. Right, this is the explanation as to why this particular piece of evidence is valid for this claim, right? So, to give you an example, right, I start with a claim, right? I am a US citizen. My backing for this is that I was born in Pennsylvania. What's the warrant that connects these ideas to each other?
Pennsylvania's in the US.
That Pennsylvania's in the US, and
That you were born.
I was born there, okay, yes. But why does Pennsylvania being in the US have anything to do with me being a citizen? Right. And what does that have to do with citizenship? There are actually other ways to be born a citizen, right? For example, if you're born abroad but your parents are U.S. citizens, then you are. No, it's that's still true. But yeah, the principle I'm invoking here, right, is the notion that anyone born on U.S. soil is a citizen. Right? That's the logical connection between these two pieces of information, right? I can make this claim because of this legal fact, right? So that's my warrant. So let's try a couple of these. Now, I give you this first example with the caveat that I know absolutely fucking nothing about sports. I do not, I know what teams were good when I was a kid. I do not know what teams are doing well. Well, I guess nobody's really playing all that much now, right? Things are kind of...
I want to say Texas and Florida are in the hockey finals.
Neither Texas nor Florida has any business having a hockey team. I'm just going to say that. If you live in a state with no ice.
Somebody said we're going back to Wii Sports times and they had fake people in the crowd.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that there are some cardboard cutouts in the stands in some places. Okay, so the claim I'm making is that the Detroit Tigers will win the World Series. Again, they were good when I was a kid. I don't know if they're still good today. All right, my backing for this they have the best pitching in the league. So what's the warrant here? What is the connecting logic between these ideas?
Their pitcher is good, so they're going to win.
Yeah, that good pitching is what wins baseball games, right? Good. All right, let's try another example here. The Democratic Convention should be held in Milwaukee, and the backing I use for this is that the party narrowly lost Wisconsin in 2016. So what's the warrant that connects these? What's the logic here for making that claim?
They did the last time, so they should go there again.
I think like,
To gain the vote.
if they hold it there, they'll win back Wisconsin's vote.
Yeah, right, that holding the convention in a place where you narrowly lost gives you a better chance of winning that state, right?
And again, somewhat popular, or like, oh, okay, I'm making my vote.
Yeah, I mean, people like attention, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Holding the convention, yes, in a state you narrowly lost. Will help you win. And one of the reasons I go through this is because this is actually not a bad model for building your paragraphs when you're writing a paper. Right, so you want to make sure that your paragraphs have a good balance between claim, evidence, and connecting logic. So, in general, your paragraph should include one example of each, right? One claim, one piece of evidence, and the warrant linking those two things together, right? Make that your organizing principle, and you won't have these super long monster paragraphs that go on and on and on. And you may also then be able to kind of draw more out of a single paragraph. A good paragraph should be about half a page long, right? Use that as your standard. Okay, so where are we? How much time do we have? Okay, so what I would like to finish with today, I have a handout for you. You can you can scribble all over this. I don't want to pack. I have a number of sets of data points on this piece of paper that are related to each other. And what I would like you to do right now is go through all of this evidence, and we're going to start doing the work of using it to generate claims, right? So what you need to do is look for connections between these pieces of evidence, right? Look for binary oppositions throughout the whole thing, right? Not just in single pieces of evidence. Look for things that repeat, right? Look for ideas that seem sort of common to most of these pieces of evidence. See how you can link them all together, right? Look for common themes here. And take your time, and we'll come back in and talk a little bit about this before class ends. And if you have any if there are words or concepts you don't recognize on there, just ask. I'm happy to explain it to you. So what patterns are you noticing so far? And, we'll come back to this at the beginning of class on Monday, right? So we'll continue this and we'll work this into our discussion of thesis development. What have you picked up on so far? What patterns do we see here? Yeah.
Everything got bigger and better.
Well, bigger anyway, right? Better is a relative term, right? So yeah, we see like things getting bigger in what senses and specifically? How did things get bigger?
Homes got bigger,
Okay.
the shops, the space in between one destination to another.
That's a big part of it, right? And when we talk about the homes getting bigger, did the living spaces in homes get bigger?
No,
Yeah, it's the garages, right, that got bigger. Okay, good. What other themes do we notice emerging, or what other patterns do we see emerging?
sense of private, closed off nature.
Okay, yeah, there's a private versus public binary here, certainly, right? And what is associated with the private here, and what is associated with public? Okay, good. Suburban neighborhoods are associated with the private, right? And urban neighborhoods with the public. So that is itself another binary, right? But these two binaries are closely related here. And what do we see as, what else do we see connected to privacy versus public space here?
Is that transportation?
Okay, transportation, yeah. How do you get around in an urban area?
You use like the bus or like the subway, depending on where you are.
Yeah, public transit or walking, right? And how do you get around a suburban neighborhood?
You drive.
Yeah, you need a private car typically, right? And how do we see this shaping the development of neighborhoods in suburban cities? And even the changes to homes.
It said that they didn't have sidewalks anymore.
Yeah, most post-war American neighborhoods don't have sidewalks. The expectation is that people are going to drive, right?
They also went from connecting grids to cul-de-sacs and
Mm-hmm.
them all from, I guess, another section. So you'd have to go a long way around.
Yeah. So does everybody understand what a cul-de-sac is and how it works? They kind of look like this. And these would be streets within the cul-de-sac, and there's one road usually going in and out. So what this does is, it kind of cuts the neighborhood off from anything around it, right? So private. But it also means they can create traffic nightmares, right? Because everybody's trying to get out onto the same feeder road.
Zoning laws.
Pardon?
Zoning laws.
Okay, yeah, zoning laws in suburban areas keeping things separate from each other, right?
I feel like that's how old was just new about.
Okay, explain.
I don't know, because like I have this thing in my head where they talk about the American dream.
Uh-huh.
Because like back in the day, that meant like you had a family of 4, you live in a small house with a white picket fence, and then
Mhm.
now like we have different visions of what the American dream really
Yeah,
is.
well, and I think that particular vision is also one that is only, it's one that comes about in a very, very small historical window, right? It's the post-World War II vision that then starts to dissipate by the late 90s, right? So we actually can see here, if we look at some of these points here, we can see actually an old becoming new again, right? If we look at the point about where younger people were moving to in the late 90s. Pardon?
It kind of goes with hers.
Uh-huh.
One of the reasons that you needed a bigger garage is because you had more cars, but the old ideal
Mhm.
that she was talking about versus the new is that women started needing vehicles because they were working more and so on.
Sure, but that suburban shift had already happened by then too, right? So, people like, if you live in most older American cities, you generally don't need a car to get around. Like I lived in New York City for 4 years. I didn't have a car. After that, I moved to DC for 8 years, and we had a car, but we only had one between the two of us, and I hardly ever drove because I didn't need to. Everything I needed was either in walking distance or I could just take the metro.
So I'm thinking like young versus old or something.
Okay, yeah, there's a young versus old thing. Yeah, there's a definite preference. Well, like, yeah, there is, so that younger people have different preferences than older people, right?
Because like where I live, we live in kind of, I guess, in suburbs, but like there's a lot of old people in my neighborhood.
Okay.
And I kind of feel like they tend to go for more like private, and then the
Yeah.
younger generation goes for more urban scenes.
Yeah, I see that in my in-laws' neighborhood as well. They live in a very conventional cul-de-sac suburb outside of Philadelphia. And they're lovely people, but the place bores the shit out of me. Again, well, because you can't, there's nowhere to go, right? It's, they're 18 miles from Center City, Philadelphia, where there is all sorts of fun and interesting stuff to do. But it will take you at least an hour and a half to get there from where they live, no matter what, just because of the way the roads are set up, right? It's not set up to be quick and easy to get to the city, because part of the idea was to not have the city come to you. Right? So,
That's something I was convenient.
pardon?
Convenient.
Okay. All right, so we're about out of time, so I keep all this in mind, right? Keep this sheet, keep your notes, because we're going to try to build some potential thesis statements out of this next time.